book of Leviticus, chapter 4, verse 35. The book of Leviticus can be challenging for any modern reader. The primary reason for this is that the author of this work is making assumptions about their audience that are entirely alien to the modern world. There are assumptions in regard to culture, worldview, cosmology, and even just simple common knowledge about the world. Some of these things the author and reader of this work would have just assumed and taken for granted at even the subconscious level. That is to say simply that the thought of needing to explain these things would have never crossed their minds. This challenge can make a lot of biblical literature, Leviticus especially, seem a bit inaccessible to modern readers. So I'm going to attempt to provide the necessary context for understanding the passage that we're going to look at here in this video. But please keep in mind that the cultural understanding the author is assuming of the reader is vast, and there's very little shared with anything in the modern world. Now, when it comes to the historical and cultural context for understanding the book of Leviticus, there are three things I want to point out here that if we keep in mind will help us understand this literature. The first thing is the source material for the book of Leviticus is very old. It would have been considered ancient even to the ancient Israelites. And the second thing is the role of ritual within the religions of the ancient Near East. And the third thing is cosmology, specifically the idea of realm distinction as it relates to temples. So let's begin. Trying to nail down a specific time, place, and reason for the authorship of the book of Leviticus is difficult, to say the least. There's no historical information given in the text that really helps us. There's no mention of any specific king or historical event, for example. But there are a few facts that can help guide our speculation. The book of Leviticus is part of what scholars call the priestly materials. And besides Leviticus, these works include most of the book of Numbers and other parts of the Torah, and some scholars even include the book of Ezekiel. And it's been fashionable to date all of these priestly materials to the post-exilic period, meaning from the 5th century BCE onward. But there is some archaeological evidence that suggests the books of Numbers and Leviticus, or at very least the source material that the authors used to compose these works, is much, much older. The first of which is the Ketef Hinnom scrolls, which are small silver scrolls that were rolled up and worn as amulets, and they date to the 7th century BCE. And on them, written in a Paleo-Hebrew script, was passages from Numbers 6, and this is the oldest known example of a piece of biblical literature. And this tells us that at least what would be the sources for the priestly material not only existed at this time, but was considered important. Now, when it comes to the book of Leviticus, the oldest copies that we have available to us are found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some could date as far back as 250 BCE, and there are a couple even written in a Paleo-Hebrew script, the oldest being one found in Cave 6 at Qumran, and the other being a rather large portion of the book was found in Cave 11. Now, this Paleo-Hebrew script was the script that Hebrew was written in before the Persian period. So it is possible that the scribes at Qumran that copied down these scrolls that were found in Cave 11 and Cave 6, they were looking at a copy of Leviticus that had a lineage that stretched all the way back to at least the time of the kings, and thus they preserved it in that old script. And when it comes to comparing the content of the book of Leviticus with other cultures of the ancient Near East, so this is things like temple layout, blood rituals, and priestly garments. That which it has the most in common with is material from the old city-states that were part of the Hittite Empire, and that stuff goes well back into the Bronze Age. So this is before the time of the Exodus. So the best speculative guess I can come up with as to a time and occasion for the writing of the book of Leviticus is that during a time of religious revival, a priest composed the book of Leviticus, using some very old sources to answer the theological question of what does it mean to be in a covenant relationship with Yahweh. This could have been perhaps during the reforms of King Josiah, or a similar situation, but at the very latest, it could have been during or just after the Babylonian exile. The next thing that's important to mention that's relevant to the passage we're going to look at, and that is the meaning of ritual to the religions of the ancient Near East. In an academic paper on this subject, I can just say that the rituals of blood sacrifices mentioned in Leviticus are mimetic psychodrama. But I imagine to most people that doesn't actually mean anything. So I will attempt to offer a clear definition of what I mean by ritual. So ritual, in the context of the ancient Near East, is a symbolic physical action that is an acting out of a non-physical reality. And this action is treated by both the person doing the action and the deity as if it is that non-physical thing. So let me define each of these elements. First, the symbolic physical action. So it is something you do, and it is symbolic, but not in the typical way we use that word today. So not as a means of communication. That is, using symbols to transfer information, like words, letters, signs, emojis. So not symbolic in that sense, but a symbol simply as a thing that is standing in for something else. An example of this type of symbol would be something like a nation's flag. A military color guard will have very specific ceremonial procedures and rules on how a flag is to be treated and how it is to be displayed, even though it is just a piece of fabric. Yet they treat it as if it is the thing that it represents. Now, the best example I could come up with for the second part, that both parties involved in the ritual treat it as if it is real, is something like a title deed to a piece of property. It's just a piece of paper with ink on it, yet when the two parties sign it, it becomes the legal reality of a transfer of ownership, but it's still just a piece of paper with ink on it. Now, another relevant thing to mention here is the general cosmology of the people of the ancient Near East. When it comes to the cosmology assumed by the book of Leviticus, what is important is the idea of realm distinction. So first, in order to avoid any potential anachronisms, let's do our best to set aside the typical way we speak about duality. That is, in terms of Platonism, Neoplatonism, Cartesian duality, or any other contemporary philosophical framework or terminology. That is to say, the distinction we make between things that we call spiritual versus physical, or immaterial versus material. Now, ancient people did have these categories, and they also had very sophisticated ways of talking about them. It's just that our modern terminology is going to be more of a hindrance to us here. So for the purposes of trying to understand the literature of the ancient Near East, that is biblical literature, we're going to try and think like an ancient Near Eastern person. We need to think in terms of realm distinction. And the clearest example of this way of thinking is displayed in the creation story of Genesis chapter 1. And there, the creator God separates the terrestrial and celestial realms. He also separates out night and day, and sky, land, and sea. And then he fills each of these realms with creatures and sets up rulers to be his representatives in the various realms. And in the mind of ancient people, traversing between these realms was very dangerous, and it's easy to imagine why they would think this way. Like if you put a whale in the desert, it will die. If you put an eagle at the bottom of the ocean, it will die. And if you launch a camel off a catapult into the upper atmosphere, it will die. Well, likely. And of course, likewise, you as a human, if you came in contact with the celestial realm or the divine realm, you will die, unless you take the appropriate precautions. Now, the way a human being would interact with the celestial realm or divine realm, since as humans we don't have a way to go up into the celestial realm, in the religions of the ancient Near East, this is done through ritual, specifically through a system of rituals that are centered around a temple being a scale model of the cosmos, with different areas or sanctuaries of the temple representing the different realms of the cosmos. So for an ancient person, when you'd cross that threshold into the temple courtyard, you would treat that as if you have just crossed into the celestial realm. And likewise, as you moved into the sanctuary and then into the inner sanctuary, you would treat that as if you were actually ascending through the celestial realm into the throne room of whatever deity you came to worship. And in that inner sanctuary would be a statue, that is to say, an idol of that deity. And thus, even though the temple is just a building and the idol is just a statue, the idea is that both you and the deity would treat it as if it is the real thing. Now, the backdrop to the rituals and ceremonies prescribed in the book of Leviticus is the tabernacle system, which is a nomad's version of a temple. It was a tent that functioned the same way. And with Israel's special covenant relationship with Yahweh, the creator of the universe, this tabernacle, on the one hand, was just a tent in the desert, and on the other, it was the celestial dwelling place of Yahweh himself. All right, so the three historical cultural things that are going to help us understand the book of Leviticus are, 1, the literary sources for the book of Leviticus are considered very ancient, and 2, the idea of ritual. That is a symbolic act that you treat as if it is the real thing. And 3, cosmology. the idea of the temple tabernacle being the place where the celestial and terrestrial realms meet. All right, let's move on. Now, the literary context provided by the author is that the book of Leviticus is the words of God spoken through Moses at the initial setting up of the covenant between Yahweh and his people. Now, the passage we're going to look at is in a section of Leviticus that is a list of sacrifices that were to be offered. Although reading it, you may think this is a manual for performing these rituals. You wouldn't actually be able to recreate any of these rituals with what is here in the text. There's a lot of detail that's left out. So what it looks like is whatever source material the author is using probably was a manual for performing these rituals at the tabernacle. And the author is only including that which they believed was necessary to get their theological message across. Chapter 1 contains a description of what is normally called the burnt offering. And the idea here is that when you come into God's house, you bring a gift. And in this instance, it's an animal, which is burned entirely upon the altar. And chapter 2 is a description of what's called a grain offering, which is very similar to the burnt offering, only you're bringing bread. And chapter 3 is a description of what is normally called the peace offering. And it is an animal sacrifice that is prepared by the priest. Part of it is given to God upon the altar, and the rest you sit down and eat. And the idea is that you're having a celebratory ritual meal with Yahweh. Now, chapter 4 contains the passage that we're going to look at closely here, and it is a description of a ritual called Chat Ta'at, which is a blood ritual requiring animal sacrifice. Now, almost all of the English translations are going to render Chat Ta'at as sin offering, which is actually pretty good for understanding it in English, but the problem is the English word sin has a moral weight to it. And what this ritual is meant to address is not necessarily a moral failing. So I think it's going to be helpful to us here if we just translate chata'at super literally. And that is meaning decontamination or purification. So this is the ritual of decontamination, of purging impurity. And what is being purged is the ritual sacred space of the tabernacle. And there are different procedures depending on who it is that caused the contamination. There's a procedure for if it's a priest or a leader, or if it's the nation of Israel as a whole, there's a special procedure for that. But the one we're going to look at is the one where the contamination is caused by a common everyday person. So this is Joe and Mary, Israelite, living out on the edge of the camp somewhere. And there's two rituals described here. One, if the sacrifice is a goat, and the other, if the sacrifice is a lamb. So this section is introduced in verse 27 and 28. If any one of the common people sins unintentionally in doing any one of the things that by Yahweh's commands ought not to be done, and realizes his guilt, or the sin which he has committed is made known to him, he shall bring. Then what follows is the description of the procedure for the ritual. So here we see what causes the need for the ritual is a unintentional breaking of one of the commandments. And these commandments are the stipulations of the covenant. And these are the moral stipulations of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself, as well as regulations about ritual purity. And what keeping these commandments is all about is the idea of Kadesh, or holiness. This goes back to the idea of realm distinction. That which is of the mundane or profane human realm, the realm of blood, sweat, and tears, death and sickness, does not belong in the presence of God. So that celestial divine realm represented by the tabernacle and the nation as a whole, because the tabernacle is in that nation, should have nothing to do with the terrestrial realm of death and sickness. So you, as Joe or Mary Israelite living out on the edge of the camp, so either by accident or just in the course of normal human events, you come in contact with a sick person, or you have to bury someone who has passed away, for example, you become ritually impure. And there is a danger of the sacred space of the tabernacle becoming polluted, and thus violating the covenant and making that space unfit for Yahweh's presence. So this purification ritual is all about maintaining that sacred space, keeping it suitable for Yahweh's presence, thus maintaining the covenant and Yahweh's continuing divine presence. Now, there's a couple of typical questions that usually come up here, so I'm just going to address them real quickly. First is, well, what happens if it's an intentional violating of a commandment? Well, in that case, there is no sacrifice for you. If you violate the covenant intentionally, you are not in a covenant relationship. The solution to that impurity is to remove the person who committed the offense by expelling them or executing them. And the other question that often comes up is, well, why does God want all of this blood sacrifice? Why doesn't he just cut them some slack and just forgive them? Well, he does just forgive them, but the way that is tangibly manifested through the actions of the person is by performing the ritual. And the fact that God just forgives them and is willing to dwell among people in spite of their failings and shortcomings, and in spite of the fact that humans are part of the terrestrial realm, the realm of death and sickness, is part of the theological point that the author of Leviticus is trying to get across here. Now, turning to the description of how this ritual would play out, is that when the common person would bring a lamb for this particular ritual, they would present it at the entrance to the tabernacle, place their hands upon it, and then kill it. And then the attending priest would then dip his fingers into the blood and smear some of it on the horns of the altar, which was just inside the entrance to the courtyard of the tabernacle. And then the rest of the blood would be poured out at the base of that altar. And the fat portions of the lamb would be then put upon the altar and turned into smoke. And now we finally come to the verse I want to look at here, and that's verse 35, or at least the second half of it. So the purpose of all of that historical, cultural, and literary context I just gave you was hopefully to help us understand what's going on in this one Hebrew phrase. And here it is. And it is a statement that describes the result of the decontamination ritual. All right, let's begin with the subject, and that is Kohen, which is the priest. So the priest is the one doing the action. And the action that was described in the ritual was the blood manipulation, the smearing of the animal's blood on the horns of the altar. And we also have in this phrase the why this ritual was taking place. And we have this word here, which is on account of him, meaning the person who brought the sacrifice. And then there's this syntax here, on account of the sin of him, which he sinned. And this syntactical construction is not uncommon, where you use one root word as both a verb and a noun in the same phrase. For example, if you make a brick, you brick a brick. Or if you make a vow, you vow a vow. And you may notice the root here of chet, tet, aleph. Here it is used as a verb, and over here you see it is used as a noun. The sin of him which he has sinned. And it's also the same root used for the name of this sacrifice. And this entire syntactical construction is just a repeat of what was already stated in verse 23. So this is the why for this ritual. So it's the sin which was sinned requires the ritual of unsinning. And we don't have to speculate too much about the meaning of this word sin here, for it's just stated at the introduction to this ritual. And that is a unintentional doing of a thing that ought not to be done. So the idea here is the doing of that thing, that unintentional breaking of that commandment, has now resulted in a contamination of sacred space. Thus, it requires this blood ritual of decontamination. So, what we have here is the priest doing a thing because of the sin that has been committed, and what he's doing is this verb here, kaper, which is typically translated as atonement. And if you would read commentaries or do word studies on this, you'll hear English words thrown around like atonement, expiation, covering, appeasement, purgation, propitiation, placation, pacification, recompense. And all of these are perfectly fine English translations of this one Hebrew verb. And if you'll allow me, perhaps an oversimplification of a description of what this verb actually means is the removal of something with something else. Like grease is removed from a frying pan with hot soap and water. Germs and bacteria are removed with disinfectant spray. A fire is removed with a fire extinguisher. So I'm going to go ahead and translate this word with the word purge, just because that English word has a little bit of force behind it. And what is being purged is the contamination because of the sin that was committed, the unintentional violating of one of the commandments. And what that contamination is being purged from is the altar, the sacred space. And what it's being purged with is the blood of the lamb, or as the ancient person would have thought of it as, the life of that creature. And the last little bit of this passage, nishlach lo, is and nishlach, the verb to forgive, and lo, to him. And it will be forgiveness to him. Now, the verb nishlach, much like the verb kiper, also has the idea of removing something. It is to remove an offense from consideration. In fact, all of these verbs here, at their roots, have some association with the idea of washing something. Although a word of warning here, you don't want to commit what is called a root fallacy. Like in English, you wouldn't think the word butterfly has anything to do with dairy products. But the fact that all of these verbs have the same kind of concept behind them, and they're all used in this context, only serves to reinforce the idea that this ritual is indeed a decontamination, a purging of impurity. So, to make a simple paraphrase of this passage, would be something like, okay, the ritual is performed, and then, thus the priest will purge on account of him, because of the sin of which he has sinned, and it will be forgiveness for him. All right, now let's talk about what the author's point may have been here. Why is he writing this? Well, we speculated earlier, the occasion for writing the book of Leviticus may have been a time of religious revival. People wanting to be God's people again, wanting to serve Yahweh and be faithful to him. Then the author of the book of Leviticus comes along and says to him, hey, do you remember all that stuff Yahweh said to us through Moses back in the day? Well, that stuff tells us that Yahweh is more than willing to be our God if we're willing to be his people. But we need to take it seriously. This interaction between the people of the terrestrial realm, the realm of sickness and death, and Yahweh in his divine presence, this is very, 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 very dangerous. And not only is Yahweh willing to be our God if we're willing to be his people, he's willing to provide the means by which this interaction can take place. That is, his grace and forgiveness. And he has prescribed the rituals by which this can be acted out. Now, given that the book of Leviticus was put together long after there was a tabernacle, and maybe even just after there was even a temple, what's being described here in the book of Leviticus is kind of an ideal worship situation. So the author's point is almost purely theological. And if you have ever read any portion of the Old Testament, you may realize that it was more often than not that all the covenant stipulations and regulations were all being broken, and God was constantly pleading with his people to make it right with him. So what becomes of all of these rituals and their meaning when the people performing them aren't taking it seriously? And God's under no obligation to take what they're doing seriously. So going back to our definition of ritual, the second part of it is the two parties treat it as if it is real. Well, in this situation, when that stops, this whole sacrificial system turns into just a pile of dead animals and blood smeared on a giant barbecue. It's utterly meaningless. Just take, for example, the words of Yahweh to his people through the prophet Isaiah. So this is what it looks like when you have the symbols of sin being washed away without the sin actually being washed away. And this is what it looks like when you have the symbol, but not the real thing. It's just a bunch of religious nonsense. What makes you think I want all your sacrifices? Says Yahweh. I am sick of your burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fatted cattle. I get no pleasure from the blood of bulls, lambs, and goats. When you come to worship me, who asks you to parade through my courts with all of your ceremony? Stop bringing me your meaningless gifts. The incense of your offerings disgusts me. As for your celebrations of the new moon and of the Sabbath, and of your special days of fasting, they are all sinful and false. I want no more of your pious meetings. I hate your new moon celebrations and your annual festivals. They are a burden to me. I can't stand them. When you lift up your hands in prayer, I will not look. Though you offer me prayers, I will not listen. For your hands are covered with the blood of innocent victims. Wash yourselves and be clean. Get your sins out of my sight. Give up your evil ways. Learn to do good. Seek justice. Help the oppressed. Defend the cause of the orphan. Fight for the rights of widows. Come now, let us settle this, says Yahweh. Though your sins are like scarlet, I will make them white as snow. Though they are red as crimson, I will make them white as wool. If you will only obey me, You will have plenty to eat, but if you turn away and refuse to listen, you will be devoured with the sword of your enemies. I, Yahweh, have spoken. So, through our little analysis of this little verse in the book of Leviticus, hopefully you can see that the author was trying to tell his readers that this whole business of God living amongst us is a very serious thing, a very costly thing, and not something to be trifled with. And if you are a Christian or at all familiar with the New Testament, hopefully you can see how this framing of these ancient rituals and the terminology used to describe them is exactly how the New Testament authors described the sacrifice of Christ, his death and resurrection, and that the purging power that his blood has didn't just sanctify some temple in Jerusalem, but is available to the entire human race. You become the temple. You are the thing that is purged with the blood of the sacrifice. And I can pretty much literally open the New Testament to any passage and show you how this understanding of this old sacrificial system was used to explain exactly what the shedding of Christ's blood actually accomplished, not in symbol, but in actual reality. I'll just point out a couple here, and I think you'll get the point. John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, was preaching repentance and baptizing people in the Jordan River. And one day Jesus met him there. And upon seeing him, John said, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world." And another one would be Hebrews chapter 9. He has entered that greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which was not made by human hands, and is not part of the created world, with his own blood, not with the blood of goats and calves. He entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. This is why the tabernacle and everything in it, which were copies of things in heaven, had to be purified by the blood of animals. But the real things in heaven had to be purified with far better sacrifices than the blood of animals, for Christ did not enter a holy place made with human hands, which was only a copy of the true one in heaven. He entered into heaven itself to appear now before God on our behalf. Now, there's so much more that can be said about this little verse in Leviticus that we looked at, but I think I'm just going to wrap this up here. So, if you are a Christian, the real thing, the real purging and cleansing of sin that takes place is by means of Christ's sacrifice, his blood. Now, in light of our discussion about ritual, consider some of the symbolic actions that Christians use to express this real thing. Well, there's two in particular. There's water baptism and the Lord's Supper, or sometimes called communion or the Eucharist. Now, let's consider both of these in light of our definition of ritual, and with the recognition that Aristotelian logic does not apply here. That is to say, the ritual action is both the thing and not the thing at the same time, like the example of the title deed that I gave earlier. It's just a piece of paper, but to everyone that matters, it is ownership. And likewise, the blood ritual of Chata'at, described in Leviticus chapter 4, is just a dead animal with its blood smeared on the altar. But at the same time, the two parties involved, that is God and the offender, it is the removal of the offense. That is, it is forgiveness. So let's do a little thought experiment, just to see what happens. So if we apply this principle of the thing being the thing and not the thing at the same time to Christian rituals, perhaps you can see, in regard to the nature of both baptism and the Lord's Supper, that these things can be challenging to talk about coherently. And just for the purposes of this little thought experiment, let's set aside the arguments about whether baptism and the Lord's Supper are symbols or sacraments, as well as arguments about infant baptism and transubstantiation. Don't worry, you can pick these things up again later. Arguments about such things have been around for a very long time. They're not going anywhere. So let's imagine if you were to approach these things as if they were real, yet knowing that baptism is just getting wet and the Lord's Supper is just grape juice and crackers, but at the same time, you approach something like baptism as if it really is your death and rebirth, and the elements of the Lord's Supper as if they really are the body and blood of Christ. Now, for the purposes of our little thought experiment, imagine you're at your baptism. You approach the water. What's going to happen? Well, on the one hand, you're just going to get wet. But on the other, you're going to really treat this as if it is your death and rebirth. Now let's just suppose that God was to reciprocate. He too was to take this just as seriously as you, and he treated this ritual of baptism as if it really was your death and rebirth. Now you have an action representing the reality of a relationship between you and God, and both of you are treating it as real. Now, the question for your contemplation. If both you and God treat something as if it is so, is that real enough?